Hi.
Hello.
Question. I would argue as well. Okay, so for example, let's say government is now spending what it was projected to spend in 2044. We've accelerated government spend by 24 years. Now, ideally, that's cyclical, but I'll go back. But the question becomes, if we're trying to get out of this crisis, did the money get to the right places? And I would argue that the savings rates at all times high. And what seems to be an obsession with keeping restaurants open, despite the fact that schools are closed. If you look at the net wealth of the wealthiest 10% skyrocketing, you might argue that all we've done is we've just taken this existing trend of internet quality and turned it into, a dysfunctional economy into a dystopian one. That's a little big, man, and big time. Well, God, we know each other well enough. I'm a class at that. So look, there's a silver lining here as big as the cloud. If this is an opportunity.
Greetings, Tim. How are you?
Well, so I'm doing okay. A little chilly today, but I kind of liked it.
Yeah, it looks like the winter is coming, huh?
Yeah, well, what we get of winter, and this is good enough for me. I'm okay with it.
Yeah. Well, it's better in Ohio or New Jersey winters.
Oh yes, I lived through my share of snowstorms and blizzards in Ohio, enough to last me a lifetime. So, if I never have to go back to that again, I'm okay with that.
Yeah. Well, we had snow here one time in South Carolina about 2 years ago. We had about an inch.
That was right. That was the winter just that they had in Savannah too, just before we moved here.
Oh, was it? Okay. I know they
Yeah.
closed the bridge for part of the day, and by midday it all melted and everything. But
Right.
they didn't have to get the plows out and the snow tires. It was okay.
Hey, Tim.
Hello, how are you?
Good. Andrew's not feeling well, so we're not going to sit in tonight, but we're going to record it
Okay.
as well. So she just wanted to let you know she's in bed. She doesn't feel real good. So I'm going to go take care of her.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. Hopefully she'll recover enough to be able to enjoy the Thanksgiving holiday.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well,
All right.
give her my best, and you guys have a great holiday.
I will.
Hey,
Thanks.
before you go, question for you. Can you record it yourself? Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh,
I know you record it, don't you, Tim?
we do. Yes, we do. We record it. It's going on YouTube. Now I think we've figured out the YouTube thing. Is it possible to record directly from this onto your own? I mean, how do
Yeah, we record I've got a recorder for just audio. So we just record the audio.
Oh, okay.
Is it on QuickTime Player do you use? Do you know?
No, we use, it is, let me see if I can, it is SoundTap by NCH software.
Oh, okay.
But any recording, QuickTime, anything like that.
Okay.
But this will record just the audio.
Okay, great. But you already recorded on YouTube. You
we
recorded
put it on YouTube as well?
Yeah, just in case it gets missed, we
Okay.
gotta back up.
We had a real
Okay,
issue with the YouTube last week.
Yeah.
I
All righty.
Okay. All right. Have a good night.
You too. Bye-bye.
I think we have figured out the YouTube. Jennifer and I were, for some reason, kept
Yeah.
blocking the YouTube thing. I don't know
It says
why,
record on this computer.
but I think I have figured out. So I think we're recording on YouTube. They are recorded also on Zoom, and we can go and pull it off the mainframe of Zoom at the synagogue and then download it to YouTube as well. So there's different ways you can do it. The easiest is if you just sign into YouTube and do a live stream. The issue is we've been having problems with that. When they were trying to live stream the funeral from Bonaventure on Sunday, they were having all kinds of technical issues. I mean, we all know that technology is a wonderful thing when it works. And I am not the most technologically savvy person in the world. Trust me.
What has he been in real estate 6 months?
So, I know what I can do and how to do what I do, but
if he keeps going like that,
Yeah.
of course, right
You know what's happened is our expectation is so high that when we turn the switch, we expect instantly that everything will work as it did, the last time we did it, whether it's a light switch or something else. And all of a sudden, something goes berserk and the car won't start or the TV doesn't work or, the phone doesn't work. And
Okay.
all
The
of a sudden-
iPhone blows up.
Right, the iPhone blows up. or something crazy happens. It's not crazy, but I mean, it's just
It's
our
frustrating.
explanations, but it's just beyond our understanding.
Well, it's frustrating because you had it working perfectly. So you expect that you've got all the, whatever, the kinks, the ideas figured out. Then the next time you go to do it, it doesn't work. You think, well, I did the same thing I did last time. Why is it not working? And that's what happened last week when we did session 2. I had everything and then it would not hook into the YouTube. So I'm madly texting Jennifer, who's at home, saying, I cannot get the YouTube connected. Can you connect it on your end? Which she was able to do.
Oh, good.
The first couple minutes got lost maybe, but other than that, the rest of it was able to be picked up.
Oh, that's good though. We were able to figure it out. Yeah.
Yeah, because
Steve and I figured out, though, I think we figured out the issue of why it wouldn't connect last week. I connected before I came on here and it was telling me it was connected. I'll know the real answer when I sign out and go to see if it's actually there or not.
now I thank you for YouTubing it because I did catch it there, Tim.
Well, that luckily I was able, because I thought if I don't get hold of Jennifer and she can't come in from the back end and get it up and running, then I thought the only option then is we pull it from we pull it from Zoom, put it on the YouTube, which you can do. The quality isn't great, but I guess it's better than nothing, you know. But like I said, you know, we love technology and we think we have it figured out, and then it doesn't do what we want it to do, and then we get frustrated. For me, it's frustrating. For me, it's always a frustration issue. I'm like, you worked last week, why aren't you working this week? So I hopefully everybody's got their plans set for whatever you're doing for Thanksgiving. I know it's not the same as it always has been for Thanksgiving, but you know, whether you're cooking a 1-pound turkey this year instead of a 20-pound turkey.
There
is no
Maybe-
1-pound turkey.
Maybe you're just having a Cornish hen this year.
We bought half a pound of sliced turkey, you know, at the deli counter
There you go.
on sandwiches.
Exactly. Turkey. I love turkey sandwiches. I, to be honest with you, when it comes to Thanksgiving, my favorite things are the side dishes. I like all the Thanksgiving side dishes more than
Nobody
the
likes
turkey.
turkey. Yep.
And I like the leftover turkey. I like turkey better, like Friday, Saturday, and Sunday after Thanksgiving.
Tim,
Yes.
tell me about your picture behind you. I'm very fascinated.
Oh, this is the gentleman who was he lived in Toledo, Ohio, where we are from. He actually left Russia out of the Pale of Settlement. He was a Russian Jew. His name is Israel Abramovsky. He somehow made his way to Toledo. He has a painting, I believe, in the French embassy. He made a fairly good name for himself as an artist, but he lived in this very dingy, small downtown Toledo apartment until the day he died. When he died, he left everything to the synagogue, all the paintings, and they found sketches and paintings just hidden everywhere in his tiny apartment. I mean, they were just everywhere. Scads of them, notebooks of them, you know, art portfolios of them, some finished, some unfinished, some were disintegrating, they were so old. So the synagogue tried to restore as much as they could. He had no one that we knew of, or they knew of, didn't know him. This was several years ago, that they could contact in terms of what do you want us to do with these?
What do you want?
What should we do with these?
I'll
So
get something.
what
Probably
they
send over.
did is they actually got the ones that were finished framed. They used some in like synagogue fundraisers and put them on silent auction and whatever. And so the one behind is one of his actually cheerier. Most of his artwork is very gloomy. It's very dark. We have a couple of his other pieces, but this is a little bit of a cheerier one because it's colorful, it's a little brighter. And so that's one of Israel Abramowski's paintings. And like I said, he was from the Pale of Settlement. I was able to get to the United States. And I don't know how he ended up in Toledo, Ohio. I have no idea how he ended up in
The
Toledo.
art museum.
The art museum.
So anyway, like I said, we have a couple of his other pieces that
It
we
is
just
the
kind of fell in
Chicago effect. Do you agree?
A what now?
A bit of a Chagall effect.
Yes, and you'll see that in some of his other work too. Like I said, a lot of it. We have another one. There's a painting of a rabbi. The face of it looks like an Orthodox rabbi, but it's very somber. It doesn't have the color of this one, but there's something striking in what he captured in the face of this rabbi. We just found his work fascinating, and so we were.
I find it
Yeah,
lovely.
they do it with that glass doesn't sweat.
So anyway, so that's the story of the painting that's behind me. I'm sitting at the dining room table, so the painting is on the wall behind me. You can probably see the menorah over here too.
Yeah.
We don't put our menorah away after Hanukkah. We leave it out because why put it away?
I hear you.
If you have pretty Jewish things, my theory is leave them out and use them. I don't want anyone to doubt when they come into my house that this is a Jewish house. And trust me, if you can't figure out that our house is a Jewish house, then I don't know what else we could do. We have a mezuzah on every, entry from one room to the next. And just because people have given us beautiful, beautiful mezuzot, and I don't want to just put them away. If they're beautiful, I want them displayed. So. Okay, I got one more minute that I'm going to start. I know some people contacted me because of the holiday coming up. They're not going to make it this week, so they'll watch the film. Some people, even though we're not doing a lot of big parties and traveling for the holiday, even if you're cooking dinner for your small bubble family or whoever relatives, cooking and getting stuff ready can be a chore. So, and maybe, I know that some people are going other places for dinner. So that's the story on that. Anyway, so it's 6:35, so I want to get started with what we've got for this evening. So this is our third part. We looked first week at, of course, how the situation in Germany and in Europe and in the world allowed for Hitler to become the powerful dictator, fascist dictator that he was. Then last week we looked at once he was in power, what did he first start to do in Germany that sort of set the groundwork for what's going to really be happening, what we're going to talk about today. So a couple of things I want to talk about just at the beginning before the actual breakout of World War II, because that's about where we're going to start. There was something called the Anschluss. And if you know your history and you know a bit about, how Hitler was, adding more and more land to the German Reich, the German Empire, the Anschluss happened in March of 1938. Actually, March 12th, if you want to be really precise, March 12th of 1938. I hear children. This is when I'm going to mute everybody. I forgot to do that. Sorry.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. If you have a question, don't forget to unmute yourself, just as a reminder. Anyway, March 12th, 1938, Austria was incorporated into the German Reich. It just became a part of Germany. It ceased to exist as an independent nation. There are many pictures of Hitler coming into Vienna, the capital city, and the crowds that are lining the streets that are waving and throwing flowers. And as I said, young women fainting as he goes by. They welcomed him. They welcomed him with parades and open arms when he took Austria into the German Empire. And I don't know who's been to Austria, who has not been to Austria, who has Austrian background. The one thing that I find interesting is frequently when you read histories of the Holocaust and other, even some of the stories of the Holocaust, Austria often wants to sort of portray itself as victims, a victim country of the Nazis, but history shows really otherwise. They were grateful for Hitler coming in. As I said, they welcomed him. So this kind of, trying to play a little bit of both sides. Oh, we were victims, but no, we really weren't because we were very grateful that Hitler came in. You can decide for yourself, but it's kind of an interesting paradox when you look at Austria's part here. So that was the Anschluss. So now we have a larger German empire. Shortly after that, in September of 1938, we would have France, Italy, the United Kingdom met with Germany because Hitler said, I want to take into Germany what's called the Sudetenland. The Sudetenland was part of greater Czechoslovakia at the time, but it was heavily populated by ethnic Germans. And so Hitler said, you know, I really want to bring this piece of land into Germany as well. So in a meeting with France, Italy, and the United Kingdom, and he said, if you give me that, I'm satisfied. I really don't want anything else. I'm good. I have Austria, I will have the Sudetenland, and I'm good. And of course, they believed him. Silly fools that they were. And this was the famous Neville Chamberlain of the United Kingdom saying that they guaranteed peace in our time. They were appeasing Hitler. This was an idea of appeasement. Give him this last piece of land that he wants, and then he'll just be quiet. He'll keep himself confined to his own nation. Peace will be restored. We don't have to worry that there's going to be conflict, that there's going to be battles and whatever, so we can breathe a sigh of relief. Now remember, this is September 30th, 1938. So in 11 months' time, they're going to find out that the whole idea of appeasement wasn't going to work and that they had basically been lied to. And then I also want to mention, because it usually comes up, in addition to obviously the genocide of the Jews of Europe, there were other groups of people who were on the list, if you will, marked by the Nazis, who were also going to be marked ultimately for persecution and at some point, very likely extinction as well. They included the Roma people. We often call them gypsies, but ethnically known as the Roma. They were marked for extinction, and many of them ended up in the camps as well. Jehovah's Witnesses were marked as well because they refused to be any kind of oath of allegiance to Hitler, because that's not what they do. That's not in their belief system. And so they were a threat. Homosexuals were also marked as being deviant, and therefore, and because they could not procreate or would not procreate, they wouldn't procreate for the German fatherland, they were marked as well, and many of them ended up in camps. So I just wanted to mention, and if you've been to Yad Vashem, or any of the even in the United States, the US Holocaust Memorial, all of these other groups are also mentioned. While predominantly focusing on the genocide against the Jews of Europe, there are parts of all of these places that also talk about other people who were marked for punishment and ultimately persecution and death. So now we get to World War II, which will provide, in some ways, a great cover for other things that are going on behind the war effort as Hitler begins to really carry out the policy of genocide, the policy of extermination against the Jews of Europe. So when does war break out? September 1st, 1939 is the fateful day of the beginning of our second world conflict, of World War II. Germany attacks Poland. Now, interestingly enough, before he attacks Poland with his armies, he had made a pact with Stalin, whom he despised, because Hitler despised communism. He really had no use for it. But because he didn't want sort of trouble, he made a pact with Stalin that, you know, I'll take sort of the western half of Poland, you sort of take the eastern half of Poland, we'll sort of split it. And, you know, then he figured he could kind of keep Stalin at bay, at least for a while. And so that's kind of what happened. Poland was being fought on both of its fronts, its eastern front, its western front. Poland was not a large militarily militarized country. And within 5 weeks, so 5 weeks after September 1st, Poland fell on the western half to the Nazis and on the eastern half to the Soviet Union. So for all intents and purposes, Poland ceased to exist. At some point, as you know, Hitler will break his pact with Stalin, move into the eastern part of Poland, and ultimately take all of Poland. But what this meant for the Jews was quite clearly, there were 3.5 million Jews living in Poland. 3.5 million. Jews comprise close to 20 to 25% of Poland's population, whereas remember, in Germany, they were less than 1%. So you have this large numbers, 3.5 million Polish Jews, a large contingent of Polish Jews now coming under ultimately what will be Nazi rule. In Poland, unlike Germany, you still had many Polish Jews who still lived in the countryside, more of a shtetl kind of life. It wasn't quite as progressive as the German Jewish community, although there were Jews living in Warsaw, many of them, which was the capital, cosmopolitan. So you kind of had this mix of those who had become modern, more reform style Jews living in the urban areas, while at the same time still having large number of Jews who were living in the more rural sections and were still following more of an agricultural way of life. But now 3.5 million that Hitler was going to have to reckon with now that he was going to have Poland under his thumb. So now begins this process of, okay, what are we going to do with, remember, he thought they were poison vermin. He wanted nothing to do with them. He thought they contributed nothing good to any society. So he simply wanted to do away with them. So now you've got these 3.5 million Jews under Poland. The first thing that happened was ghettoization. When you talk about ghettoization, it's where an ethnic or national group of people live together in one area. For example, think in New York City, way back, one time there were areas of New York where the Italians lived and where the Jews lived and other ethnic groups. So Hitler wanted all of the Jews to live in certain areas of the cities. So they would mark off an area of the city. They would put barbed wire around it. They would build brick walls around it. They would only build a limited number of entry and exits out of the ghetto that could be guarded at all times. So, and at some point on a given date, all Jews living in, and we're going to talk mostly about Warsaw. It's the one we know the most about. So I use it as a good example, but realize these ghettos were being set up in other Polish cities as well, and in some of even the smaller towns and the smaller cities. It was a way to, I mean, if you think from Hitler's point of view, and I hate saying that, but if you think from his mindset, get them all together in one place first, so that ultimately you're not going to have to go out searching for them. You're not going to have to go out looking for them, trying to round them up. You will have done that part of the work already. So if we look at Warsaw, which had the largest of the Jewish ghettos that were created in now Nazi-occupied Poland, it was the largest. It was the capital city. It was a major city in Poland. 450,000. 450,000, so slightly under 500,000, 450,000 Polish Jews were now squeezed into an area of Warsaw that at one time had housed 40,000. So you've got 450,000 now in an area that at one time had a population of 40,000. Those are vastly different numbers. I mean, try to comprehend the idea of, okay, this was an area, neighborhood where 40,000 people lived, and now we're going to squeeze 450,000 people into this area. The date for all Jews in Warsaw to be within the ghetto walls was November 15th, 1940. So November 15th, 1940, all Jews in Warsaw had to leave their homes wherever they had been living and move within the ghetto walls. They were allowed to take with them pretty much only what they could carry, only what they could pack in a bag, maybe throw it on a wheelbarrow or something like that. There were going to be no moving vans moving everything into the Warsaw ghetto. The entire area of the ghetto, how large was it? It was approximately 1 square mile of area. That's it. That's it. And so now you've got all of these Jews coming from outside, moving into the ghetto, bringing with them only what they could carry. And in addition, Jews who were living in the countryside outside Warsaw were also being brought in to the Warsaw ghetto. So it's just extremely, extremely overcrowded. I mean, crowded conditions that I have a hard time even envisioning or imagining. It was built in one of the oldest, most rundown sections of Warsaw. It was, as I said, surrounded by walls. It was surrounded by barbed wire. And the walls at the top, they had actually put shards of glass. So anybody trying to reach up onto the wall was obviously going to be injured as well. As I said, the entrances were guarded. There were curfews, even within the ghetto. At what times could the Jews living in the ghetto leave their homes now? That was, a curfew was established. They could not be out after dark. There was no privacy. You were assigned a spot in one of the rooms, in one of the homes in the ghetto, and you might have a completely strange family living with you that you had never seen before. So the idea of keeping some sense of privacy with your own family just didn't exist. It just didn't exist. You just had strangers, people who had never seen each other. You had urban Jews living with rural Jews. It became quite a difficult moment. Excuse me a minute, I need to let the cat in. Okay, sorry about that. He's not very patient. He was knocking on the door, so I had to let him in. So anyway, you've got this horrible situation. Water use was curtailed in the ghetto. You generally only had running water for limited amounts of time. And that was going to be used to keep yourself clean for just basic health and sanitation, in addition to drinking water, in addition to trying to have a way to clean your clothes. In the winter, very little heat was provided for the ghetto. Food rations, I mean, it was not going to be a situation where you were going to have, as much as you wanted to eat. Here, I will give you an example of the food rations in the Warsaw ghetto. For the ghetto Jews, the Jews living inside the ghetto walls, their ration came out to 184 calories a day. 184 calories per day. Try to imagine surviving on 184 calories a day. I mean, it's not sustainable for human life. So clearly there was a greater plan behind the ration. Contrast that, Gentile Poles who were helping the Nazis to keep the ghetto running, the Gentile Poles got 699 calories per day. So 699 for them versus 184 for the Jews. Still not a great amount of food, but 699 is better than 184. Now the Germans who were in charge of the ghetto and who were running the ghetto, and who were in charge of the ghetto, got rations that amounted to 2,613 calories per day. So again, that's 2,613. So the Germans with 2,613, the Gentile Poles with 699, and the Jews with 184. It does not take a large leap of thought here to see that starvation was part of the goal here. That clearly that was part of what was going on in these ghetto walls, that they were going to lose a certain number of men, women, and children to starvation because you can't survive. Because food was so limited, smuggling became big, big business. And one of the most interesting things in terms of the smuggling in the ghetto was the primary smugglers within the ghetto were children. children. Why? They were smaller. There were little gaps here and there in the ghetto wall. I mean, this was very hastily built, so don't envision this beautiful solid wall. It was not like the Berlin Wall. I mean, they built it very quickly. And so there were little gaps toward the bottom here and there, places that had been dug out. Well, a child could more easily slip through than an adult. So the children would slip through to what they called the Christian side of the wall in Warsaw and go out begging for food. The other advantage of children being the smugglers, sad as it may seem and horrible as it is, people were more likely to take pity on a small child. Seeing a small child, Jewish or not, begging for food, people would be more likely to perhaps give them something to take back. So smuggling was business. Another route for smuggling, which was used, was the sewer system. There were sewers that, like in any city, where you could go down into the sewer system and find your way underneath the wall and come up out of the sewer again on the Christian side of the wall. There was actually a young Jewish kid, I think he was about 12, so he's not a total small child, 12, old enough to kind of figure it out. And they used to call him the sewer rat, because he knew the sewer system so well that he could find his way out of the ghetto through the sewers, come up on different parts outside. So he wasn't always going to the same place, and on the Christian side of the wall, and do his begging and then ultimately smuggle things back in. Now, if you were caught smuggling, it was going to be instant death. And they didn't care if it was a child or not. It still was, the punishment was severe, it was death. But it was a way for an attempt to bring more food inside the ghetto walls. Bargains with Gentile Poles could be made sometimes, but then you had to be careful because it only took somebody to turn you in. And that was a risk. If you were begging for something, you were making some kind of bargain, because some of these kids would go outside the ghetto and they would take jewelry. If somebody had brought jewelry with them into the ghetto in their bag, and try to make deals and try to make bargains, whatever you could do. It became a matter of life and death. So you took whatever you had of value, you took whatever you could, and you tried to make a deal. And you tried to get some food to bring back for your family. I mean, it was horrible. And so people were hungry. They were not able to keep themselves clean. I mean, basic hygiene. And so disease became an issue. And again, and this is something where clearly the Nazis had a bigger plan here. Diseases spread rapidly due to the conditions in the ghetto. Typhus ran rampant through the ghetto. If someone in your family died, the only thing you had no way to bury them. You had no way to give them proper burial rites. So you simply put the body out in the streets and the cart would come through and they would put the body on the back of the cart and off it would go. Because that's all you could do. The other thing that would happen, and again, it's hard for us to imagine living in conditions like this. If someone in your family died, you tried to keep it secret rather than throw the body out, because if they didn't know the person was dead, you could still get their ration card, which meant a little more food for everybody. Not a lot, but a little more food. So if you kept the death a secret, at least even for a while, how? Keeping the body inside with you or finding a way to dispose of it without being seen, I guess, it kept the ration card in force. It wasn't canceled. So you got a little bit more food that way. So death was happening in the ghetto. In spite of that, and this again is somewhat remarkable, in spite of that, they attempted to open schools for the children inside the ghetto, still teach them. They attempted to do as best they could to celebrate the Jewish holidays as best they could, to keep Shabbat as best they could. It wasn't easy. They didn't just sort of throw up their hands in complete despair. They tried to keep some semblance of life going as best they could. And so knowing full well that, I mean, nobody knew at this point exactly what was in store for them, but they clearly knew as they could look around that people were sick and people were dying. And this was a very, very horrific situation. So that's what the whole business of ghettoization of the Jews of Poland. They would also do ghettoization in some of the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, when those fell under the Nazis. Any questions about the whole ghetto thing that anybody may have? Yes, Larry. Gotta unmute
I
yourself.
just wanted to mention that there was a film a couple of years ago. I think the name of it was called In Darkness. And not only did it show how they use the sewers for smuggling and communication, but people actually lived in the sewers. And they were, actually used for cooking and, just 24/7. They were there for, many, many months. And the Germans would send patrols down into the sewers and things like this. It's a very grim film, but if you, really want to see, it's based on, some very true facts.
Right. And there's some, there were photographers who photographed life in the ghetto. You can find some of those. There were a couple, actually one of the photographers of ghetto life in Warsaw was actually a Nazi. And they found his pictures after the war. We know the most about Warsaw because there were people keeping very accurate records and journals. And because they kind of knew that they knew what they were doing was illegal, according to the Nazis, they buried them. They buried them in milk cans, interestingly enough. After the war, and when the Nazis were defeated, they found 3 of the 4 milk cans, the big tin, like on a dairy farm milk cans, that were stuffed with diaries and writing, and in some cases poems and things that people had written in the ghetto, but a way to chronicle what was going on day by day. And
The
so
largest building in Warsaw is the Peugeot building, which is not a tremendously large building. It's probably about maybe 15 stories tall. And that was the site of the Great Synagogue, which was destroyed on the last day when they destroyed the Warsaw Ghetto, the Great Synagogue. But there's a plaque on the outside of that. But if you go across the street, if you ever happen to be in Warsaw, they have a Jewish Historical Society. And the first thing that you do is you walk in and you see this giant wall, this giant map on the wall there. And it's a map of Poland at the time of the Nazi invasion in 1939. And every square inch has got a dot on it, and every dot was a shtetl. And that was what really made it easy for the Germans, the Nazis, basically to find the Jews. They didn't even have to put those people into ghettos because they knew where they were. Whereas in Warsaw, they were, as you say, dispersed, throughout the city. So they were an easy find. They were an easy capture for them, the ones that were in the shtetls.
Exactly. Okay. Anything else on ghettoization? Yes, Floss.
Yes. When did they start wearing the stars?
That would be shortly after the Nazis came in, and then within the ghetto, even though they were all within the ghetto, they still had the requirement of having to wear. In Warsaw, it was an armband. They had a white armband with a blue Star of David on it. In other places, they would have it sewn different. It was different depending on who was in charge of which particular area. They would have them sewn onto the outside of their clothing. But that was generally an order that was given very shortly after the Nazis would come in. And that all Jews had to be quickly identifiable simply by sight.
And it was at any age they wore it, even small children too?
Children were not exempt, no.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, moving on to, this is such a cheery day. The Einsatzgruppen, a nice big German word for you, which is usually translated, this German is not always, like all language, not always easy to translate literally into English, but it's usually translated in Holocaust studies as mobile killing squads or mobile killing units, if you will. But the German word was the Einsatzgruppen, which just sounds awful. But mobile killing squads or mobile killing units. It is estimated, I'll talk a little bit more on what they were and how they operated, but it's estimated that 1.5 million, again, just get the number right, Jews were murdered by these mobile killing squads or these mobile killing units, because that was their only goal. Their only goal, the only reason they existed, was to murder Jews. They had no other goal and no other purpose. Now, these mobile killing squads came into play as Hitler attacked Russia, breaking his treaty, his pact with Stalin, moved into Russian territory, moved into Ukrainian territory. This is primarily where these mobile killing squads were unit, some in Poland as well, but much more in the Soviet Union, Ukraine, that area. Once the armies came through and declared victory, it was only a short time after, very short time after, that these mobile killing squads would move in right after the army had control. Because part of the way they worked was to sort of take the local Jewish communities by surprise and give them no time to leave, flee, plan to do anything. The first thing that happened is once Jews were found living in a rural area, in a town, in a city, whatever, they were forced to hand over all of their valuables and all of their clothing to the Nazis. So in other words, you're not going to be left with anything. What happened to these things? Well, after it was picked over by the Nazis, a lot of it got sent back to Germany and would be distributed in Germany among German citizens. Once they had ransacked and taken what was valuable and taken the clothing, the victims would be marched usually to an area that was sort of an open field or an area where there were ravines or ditches, usually on the outskirts of town, and they would be lined up and they would be shot sort of firing squad style. So they would line up, they would be stripped naked, which number one was extraordinarily embarrassing. And then they would line up oftentimes on the edge of a grave that had already been dug. Oftentimes the Jews were digging their own grave prior to being shot. And then they would line them up and shoot them. And then the next group would come up, line them up, and those bodies would fall upon the bodies that were already there until you had a full mass grave. And the order was given that it was only to be one bullet per victim. Now, if you're smart enough, you know sometimes one bullet is not going to bring about death if it doesn't enter the body at the particular point or whatever. Not to get too technical on it, but oftentimes some of these people fell into these pits, these open mass graves, and they were not completely dead, but ended up being crushed by the bodies that were falling on top of them. And so this would go on until, in whatever area they were in, until the entire population of the area of the town, wherever, was dealt with, was taken care of, and then they would move on to the next area. The question often comes up, so I'll deal with it now. What were the people in these towns who were not Jewish doing while these Jews were being rounded up, marched out, and summarily murdered? They gave little to no help to their Jewish neighbors. Most of them stood back. They watched. Did they watch out of fear? I suppose. Did they watch out of fear of what might happen to them? I suppose. Did they watch because it was latent anti-Semitism and they perhaps were okay with the fact that their Jewish neighbors had been marched off and killed? Any or all of them, I suppose, are probably true. The largest massive execution that these Einsatzgruppen did was a place in the Ukraine near the city of Kiev. Kiev is the capital city of Ukraine. And at a place called Babi Yar, which is B-A-B-I-Y-A-R, which means Old Woman's Ravine in the Ukrainian language, in a matter of 2 days, in 48 hours, 34,000 Jews were marched out and shot in 2 days. It is the largest action of these mobile killing squads. 34,000 in 48 hours of time, men, women, and children. Remember, they didn't care. It was any age. You were old, you were young, you were, teenager. There was no discrimination. You were Jewish, you were going to die. That's just the way that it was. Now, people often ask, so who made up these, who were the people who were willing to go out and do this? Who made up these mobile killing squads? Well, it is estimated from what we know, there were about 3,000 men who were part of these mobile killing brigades, about 3,000 from what they know. Who were they? First of all, they were indoctrinated. You are doing your part for a greater Germany. You are doing your part to make Germany great again. You are doing your bit for the fatherland. We know that these people who made up these killing squads were college professors. They were Christian pastors. They were lawyers. They were teachers. These were not lowlifes of society. These were educated people who bought into the propaganda that they were doing what they could to help Germany. And that even, to me, makes it even more grim that we can take people who are supposedly educated, professional people, and convince them that what they are doing is perfectly okay. It's perfectly fine if you're doing it for your country. They were ridding Germany of the enemy because the Jews were the enemy. And then they had to go home at some point to their wives and their children. And, did they talk openly about what they did? I don't know. They used the Nazis were big on euphemisms, words that don't sound like what they really are. They loved euphemisms. So they referred to this as like sort of special treatment. So they said, well, the victims, the Jews are being given special treatment, because that doesn't sound so bad. It doesn't sound like, lining them up and shooting them. It doesn't sound like mass murder. It doesn't sound like extermination. So they were being given special treatment. So as I said, about 1.5 million Jews died in this way under the auspices of these mobile killing squads or these mobile killing units. Okay, before we move on, any questions here? Okay, then we will move on. So now we're going to look at the Wannsee Conference, because here is where the final solution, as it came to be known, again, the final solution doesn't sound nearly as bad as mass extermination of the Jews of Europe. It was another nicer term than saying the mass extermination of the Jews of Europe. It was called the final solution. Technically, the full name was the final solution to the Jewish question, but usually is abbreviated as merely the final solution. And what I have listed on the outline that I gave you are the names of the 6 death camps that ultimately would be put into operation. Death camps, different from concentration camps in the sense that the death camps were just what the name says. They were factories of mass murder. That was why they were set up. That is why they were built. And that was their sole business, was really for mass murder. So you've got the 6 named there: Belzec, Chelmno, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, and Auschwitz. Auschwitz is the one, of course, that most people are most familiar with, and it was the largest. All of them, by the way, we should take note of, are in Poland. Hitler did not, and the Nazis did not set up any of their, now there were concentration camps throughout Germany, yes, there were. But death camps, specifically places of mass murder, there were no death camps anywhere other than on Polish soil. And again, the question is often asked, why were they built all on Polish soil? Hitler, first of all, did not want them in Greater Germany to mar the German countryside. Second, Hitler knew that he could play upon these sort of latent years of Roman Catholic anti-Semitism, because Christians in Poland were predominantly Roman Catholic. He knew that he could sort of build on that latent anti-Semitism that existed within the Roman Catholic Church and was a part of some of Polish history. And just that anti-Semitism had been a problem in Poland in the past. And so Hitler kind of said, knowing that that's there, I don't think I'll get resistance, or I'll get as much resistance if I move into Poland and put them there. So that kind of answers that question in a sort of simplistic way. So what was the Wannsee Conference itself? Well, it was on January 20th, 1942. So the war has been raging now. It's going into year 3. In the beginning of the war, if you know your history of World War II, Hitler is conquering nation after nation. He's gaining more and more land, more and more territory. Of course, with each nation, with each country, more and more Jewish populations, sometimes large, sometimes small, are coming under, the auspices of Nazi governments that are set up. So the situation for the Jews of Europe in many of these countries and in many of these nations was, of course, quite grim. So on January 20th, 1942, 15 Nazi German officials, 15, met at a lovely villa on the shores of Wannsee Lake. So Wannsee is a lake outside of the city of Berlin in Germany. So they were called to this formal meeting on January 20th, 1942. And their sole purpose in being called to this meeting by the Nazi higher-ups was to discuss the final solution to the Jewish question, was to discuss, okay, what are we ultimately going to do with the millions of Jews that are now under Nazi control? Certainly those in the ghettos were dying because of starvation and disease. The Einsatzgruppen were lining up, many of them in certain areas, but they wanted something, and again, it boggles my mind to have to say this, and it bothers me every time I have to say it. They wanted something faster and more efficient. Death was going to become a commodity, and it was going to become a commodity that had to be faster, it had to be more efficient. Things were not moving quickly enough for the Nazi higher-ups, for the Nazi government. At this rate, it would take them too long to finish the job of genocide. So that's what they were going to discuss. And these, again, were people who had families at home, who were sitting around a table in a lovely villa discussing mass murder. And so this term, final solution, became their code name or their euphemism or their code word, whatever you want to call it, for the extermination, the genocide of German Jews. This way, if any documents were found that said something referencing the final solution, there were no words on the document that said anything about mass murder. There were no words on the document that said anything about extermination. So using these sort of code words, if a piece of paper or a document got into the wrong hands, or God forbid, got into Allied hands, they would not know the code terminology. Hence the idea of the final solution. Now, before we go any further, realize this is not the beginning of the killing. As you've seen, death is already happening. So this isn't the start. This is merely an escalation. This is taking what's already happening in the ghettos, in the countrysides, under Nazi governments, and moving it to a level where, as I said, it's going to be faster and it's going to be more efficient. And it's going to cost less as well. So that was something they considered. So this is the first time that we know of in history where a modern state, a modern industrialized Western nation is committed, its government is committed to the murder of an entire group of people, As far as we know, that had not happened before, according to scholars. So here you have, because Germany was considered a very modern industrialized nation, now committed to the mass murder of a particular group of people. Not one person at this meeting objected or raised any voices of objection. Everybody signed off on it. Everybody was in agreement that this was going to be what they had to do or where it was going to take the next step. And so this was the beginning of ultimately the death camp system. One after another, these camps were set up. And again, if you know your history at all, many of these camps were near to Polish towns and cities. They weren't set off somewhere where nobody could find them. There is a town of about 30,000 people that is literally within walking distance of Auschwitz, Auschwitz in Poland. It existed at that time. It still exists today. So, you know, these things were not being done completely in total secrecy in the countryside of Poland. The people who lived in the area certainly had some idea of what was going on, certainly could get some notion of what was happening. So to just quickly go through what I think a lot of people know, they brought the prisoners into the various camps by train, by cattle car. And of course, this was not going to be in any way a luxurious train ride. They were crowded, so crowded that people did not have room to sit. There were no sanitary facilities, as in toilets. There was a bucket in the corner, and it's where you did what you had to do while everybody else was watching. Train rides aren't always smooth. It could fall, it could spill, and of course, we don't have to go into that. In the wintertime, these cars were very, very cold, and in the summertime, they were very, very hot. And remember, the people that are being put onto these train cars, cattle cars, if you will, many of them are already in poor physical shape. So will not be able to endure this horrible train ride. So will oftentimes perish along the way. If someone perishes along the way on the train, there's nothing to do with the dead body until it finally stops. At times, these trains would stop because they had to let supply trains for the war effort get through. So it would sit, and it would sit in the heat or the cold before it would move on. It's horrific conditions, as you can guess. When it finally reached whatever camp it was being sent to, the doors would open, and one of the first things, the order would be given to throw the dead bodies out. Throw the dead bodies out first. Let's do away with that. Let's get rid of that first. And then the victims would get off the train. And oftentimes there would be someone standing there who would ultimately sort of, for lack of a better word, sort of play God. Determine who was going to go to the side where you're going to die pretty much immediately, and who's going to go to the side where we might be able to work you for a while before we're going to kill you. Both sides led to death. Let's just face it. One right away, and one just a little bit later down the road. There was a whole lie, as you know, that was told to these people to try to keep them from getting too upset, from getting too anxious. They were told, of course, they were going to a shower because, you know, they needed to be cleaned up, and then they would be reunited with their families. I mean, they carried the lie through to remember where you put your clothes because you're going to need to find them after the shower. And the psychological business behind this is, you know, after you just got off this horribly filthy, dirty train ride, what would sound better than to be able to take a shower? I mean, in a way, it's the most psychological mind game you can play with people. Give them something that they're going to want. At some points, they even went so far as to carry the lie through as to give them a little piece of soap when they went in, so that they would think, still to the last second, to the last moment, that they really were going to take a shower. But of course, it was just a lie. So once they were put into the rooms where there were shower heads protruding from the walls to keep the lie going, to keep the facade up, and the door was closed, of course. There was no water, there was no shower, there was merely poisonous gas. In most of the camps, because it was fast, it was efficient, Zyklon B was the gas that was used. It was a gas that had been used as a rat poison prior. Death could, once it got into the lungs, it was a matter of before death would occur. Your natural instinct, of course, is to breathe, and you can't help but breathe. And as you breathe it in, it simply burns, and death comes within a matter of minutes. There would be a Nazi officer assigned to keep his ear and through the peephole to see when death was complete. And then the gas chamber, of course, had to be cleared out for the next round. But of course, the Nazis were not going to get their nice spanking uniforms dirty. So it was Jewish prisoners who did the work of taking the bodies out of the gas chamber, putting them on a cart, and ultimately taking them away to either be burned in the crematorium or to be put into mass graves, depending on what the situation was in the camp. That was Jews. And movies have been made where we've seen representations of this, and the idea of they called these people who did this job, horrible job, the Sonderkommando, the death squad. These were Jews who, and then imagine if one of the bodies you're taking out is someone from your own family or a friend or a neighbor or whatever. You could just imagine what that must have been like. But of course, the Nazis didn't care. That was not the point. Get the work done and get ready for the next group. In some of the camps, when the camps were running efficiently, you could do 35 to 40,000 corpses in a day for the efficiency. And it's just hard to imagine, this idea of turning mass murder into this sort of efficient business. But that's what it was all about. So trains were coming in from various parts of Europe as different countries fell under the Nazis, and Nazis would take over the government. Some of the train rides were rather long when you had trains coming from countries that were farther away, from countries in Southern Europe. You had train loads of Greek Jews coming in all the way from Greece. You had train loads of French Jews coming in all the way from France going into Poland. So sometimes these horrible, perilous journeys were long journeys, sometimes not so much, but nonetheless, it was horrific. The other thing the Nazis, again, did not want to waste anything. So gold teeth, gold fillings would be extracted from the dead bodies before the bodies would be either burned or buried, because that was something that could be used. It could be sent back to Germany and could be melted down. So again, don't waste anything. Any questions about the final solution, the death camps, comments, questions, whatever from anybody? Yes, Mark.
It's been said, well, in the death throes, this is not pretty, but the body evacuates.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been one of the literary descriptions that I heard was that the Nazis were willing to wade through tons of excrement on the way to Edelweiss.
Yes, I suppose that's true. It's horrific, and you're right, it's not pleasant. Different accounts of even Nazis who wrote accounts that were found after the war, they would talk about the screams, and sometimes they would hear interesting enough, they would hear the words of the Shema being recited by those who were inside the gas chamber at the point of death. It's beyond, in many ways, what we can comprehend, or what we even want to comprehend. I don't know that I even want to comprehend it. It's that horrible. I don't want to comprehend even the idea that people are sitting around a table discussing extermination as a business of a westernized industrial nation. Anyway, but it's there. It's what we have to deal with as the fact. Anybody else? Yes.
You had mentioned that the agreement between Stalin and Hitler, and they kind of divided Poland up a little bit. What happened to the Jews that were in the so-called Soviet sector, the Russian sector?
Well, interestingly enough, when the Soviets and the Nazis had this pact with Germany, some of the Jews who were under German rule initially tried to flee and get out of the Polish section into the Soviet section because they felt things would be better under the Soviet rule, which for a little time actually was true. But then ultimately what happened was Hitler, didn't live up to his end of the agreement, and he took over that part of Poland anyway, and then moved into parts of Russia. And of course, many of those were the Jews who fell at the firing squads or who would ultimately then end up in one of the camps.
What happened in Vichy, France also? the Jews try to leave the Nazi occupied and go into the so-called Free France or whatever Vichy France was
Yeah,
called?
whenever there was an opportunity, they would try to leave, sometimes successfully. I mean, there were a certain number that would be able to get from Nazi occupied zones into zones that were not Nazi occupied. It was not large numbers. And again, the sad thing is so many were not able to find help among the local citizenry. Now, as you know, there are some, and occasionally there were groups of people who did decide that they would help, but not nearly enough. Not, I mean, and you received a bounty. If you turned in Jews who had escaped or were trying to escape, and you turned them into the Nazi, took them back and turned them into the Nazi officials, you were rewarded. So there was that. And remember, we're in war and things are rationed and times are tough. I'm not saying it, I don't excuse it, trust me, but you can see where it was playing on people's minds. Yes, Carrie?
I found out through DNA about, well, I knew my grandfather was Polish, and I was hoping I'd find out he's Jewish, but he's Roman Catholic. And I've connected with second cousins who are Catholic, and I guess it's probably a touchy subject. I didn't know how horrible it was until you just told us. So I don't even know what to say to him now, even though he's born way after all this happened.
I mean, Poland, as those of you who took the class, we talked about the history of Jews in Poland. Poland had a period of trying to really reconcile its past a bit of what it did during the Holocaust. But now with its very nationalistic right-wing government, they're backing off of that. And anti-Semitism is on the rise in Poland again, sad to say. And so they seem to be going backwards rather than going forwards in trying to deal with this very difficult past that they have.
What is your understanding of the relationship of the Pope at the time? How complicit was he?
Very, very touchy subject. Well, Pope Pius XI was Pope when Hitler came to power, and he's the one that signed the agreement, the Concordat with Hitler. If you leave me alone and let my priests run their parishes and their churches, you know, I won't interfere in governmental business, was the idea. And he was roundly criticized for that. And pretty much Catholic priests were told, don't speak out against the government, just, you know, run your parish, run your church, and just, you know, keep your head down. There were priests who did speak out. If you know the story of Father Bernard Lichtenberg, Father Lichtenberg was the pastor of St. Hedwig's Cathedral in Berlin, and he was viciously anti-Nazi. He spoke from the pulpit during Sunday services against the Nazis. After Kristallnacht, when the synagogues were burning, he said, the synagogue is a house of God, just like this church, and now it's burning. He was told, he was warned to keep his mouth shut. He didn't, and he was eventually arrested and he was killed. He has been made, he's not a saint of the Catholic Church, but he's like a step below. He's on his way. I don't know exactly how that goes. So they're right now, if you're aware, they just opened the Vatican archives on the Holocaust. They weren't supposed to open them for a certain number of years. They have opened them early. And there are scholars who are Jewish, who are Holocaust experts, who are Christian, are going through all of those papers right now. And it's going to be very interesting to see what they come up with. But that's happening right now.
Did any get to Switzerland?
There were some, yes, who could get to Switzerland, yes. Was neutral. Countries that bordered, those who were in formerly Austria or Germany, the parts that were in the south that were near Switzerland, wasn't an easy trek because now you're in the Alps, if you remember the end of The Sound of Music even, which was difficult. And again, but you know, if it's a matter of life and death, you do what you have to do sometimes. And so, yes, and Switzerland kind of, interestingly enough, just sort of turned the other way and let the people come in and didn't really make a big deal about it.
There are also some very famous stories, obviously, in The Righteous Gentiles, you know, about the Japanese and whatever he was, the minister there at the time who signed the visas at the last minute. And
yes.
I think there was even one entire yeshiva that went to Shanghai, didn't they?
Yes, there was rescue that where there was a Jewish community that was allowed, and did pretty well in Shanghai. There are still remnants of that Jewish community in Shanghai today. The people who
You said previously when the St. Louis got to Cuba, the Cubans turned them around, but did not also Roosevelt play an unfortunate negative
yeah.
part in that as well?
Oh, yes, Roosevelt was, I mean,
Absolutely.
Roosevelt was not a friend of the
Well, he
Jews.
was anti-Semite to the hilt.
So yes, I mean, he did not do really anything. One of the books I'll have on your bibliography that I'll send out next week, because I'm adding some suggestions from people to it, is called The Abandonment of the Jews. It's one of the best books I ever read. And it's all about the US response to the Holocaust and to what was going on in Europe during, Nazism. And it does not paint a pretty picture of the United States government and the authorities, including FDR in the government, and its attitude toward what was happening. It's a very disheartening book to read, but it's very well documented. I cannot think of the writer's name right now, David Wyman, maybe. Anyway, it's a great book. I highly recommend it if you really want a really thorough looking at the US response to the Holocaust. I don't know that I've read a book that's better than that one.
And
What's the name of the book again?
The Abandonment of the Jews.
Morgenthau, of course, he got involved in an indirect way, as I recall, because they had to ransom some of the Jews, and they had to take it out of the State Department's hands, which was basically anti-Semitic in the State Department. And he and Treasury had to come up with some kind of money in order to get this, in order to ransom it. And I think Morgenthau got, raised a lot of the money, in which he ransomed at least several thousand of the Jews to get out of Germany, before the Holocaust even started.
Right.
He was one of the few that was sympathetic, of course, and of course he was Jewish.
Right. No, I mean, there were people who were trying. It wasn't like every single person. There were those like Morgenthau who tried to speak up and tried to do what they could, and they did some things, but there was not a massive effort by any stretch of the imagination on the part of the US government to do a rescue, a massive intervention of rescue.
What about the Rothschild family? What did they do?
I'm sorry, what now?
The Rothschild family. What did they do?
I don't know specifically. I can't answer that. I don't know.
But they were big time bankers all over Europe, right?
Right.
I was going to say, even the stories about bombing of the rail lines that led in and out of the concentration camps. The excuse at the time was, let's not divert any war resources. Let's keep bombing, the German military, and we can't afford to do it. But Eisenhower was really appalled when he got into the camps. I mean, he first saw it, and then he actually brought people from the neighborhood into the camps, who the citizens of Poland, into Auschwitz and other places.
Eisenhower took a very, very stern stance on what his soldiers found as they began to liberate, areas under Nazi control, including areas of death camps and concentration camps. He clearly wanted a very, very strong documentation of what had been going on.
You spoke before, my turn.
All right, well, we're going to move on. So, okay, we've been talking about a lot of really horrible things. Let's talk about a few glimmers of hope, because among all of this horrific attempt for mass extermination, what we now call genocide, there were some glimmers of hope. And again, there are some stories out there that are pretty fascinating. So if we look at the idea of rescue, there were some some non-Jews who were willing to put their own lives on the line and to try to rescue Jews who lived in their towns, Jews who were neighbors, Jews that they knew. They tried to do what they could. And what they could do, some hid, as you know, like the whole story of Anne Frank. There were some non-Jews who in their homes, in their barns, on their farms, they would take a Jewish family or a Jewish person in, and they would hide them and try to, even though food was scarce during wartime, give them something to eat, help them move along if they were trying to escape so that they would not be captured or recaptured by the Nazis. Try to get them across the border. There's a town in France, Les Chambons or something, my French is really bad, where the minister of the church spoke out against Nazism and what was happening. And he got his congregants, his wife, his congregants, his daughter, small town, this was not a big city, and they made a massive effort to help any Jews in the area and any that could get to them, to help them to hide, to save them, place them somewhere where they could survive. Some took in children.
Yeah, it's one congregation.
Some took in children. There are cases of monasteries, convents of nuns who took in children, but that would get ugly. I don't want to go too far off base here, but they would raise the children in their schools and orphanages as Christians, giving them new identities so that they could survive. It got ugly after the war, and this is, we don't talk about the complicity of the Catholic Church, when survivors of these families of children, whether it was aunts, uncles, whoever, tried to come and claim them, the church was not always very forthright in giving them back. They said, oh, well, they're Jew, they're Catholic now. We've baptized them. We've made them Catholic. And so we can't give them back to you and have you, raise them as Jews, because they're not Jews anymore. So there are those stories, and it gets kind of nasty at times where it has to go to court. And there are court cases about who really has the right to raise the child and to keep the child. There were people who did things like making forged identity papers for people. Forgery was huge during this time period. If you could get forged papers, that might be a way to help you live a little bit longer. We could get into stories of a lot of individuals that stories are known. We know the story of Oskar Schindler from Schindler's List. Many of you may know the story of Raoul Wallenberg, who helped to save a number of the Jews in Budapest by taking them into what he called safe houses and giving them false papers that said they were under the protection of the Swedish government. And he put a Swedish flag on the house and he said, this is Swedish territory, because he was a Swede by birth, even though he was educated at the University of Michigan in the United States. He said, these are under the Swedish government. You can't touch them. You can't touch them. He would actually go to the train tracks and pull the people off the trains before the trains were taking off. And he'd hand them a paper and say, you're under my protection. You are under the protection of the Swedish government. And because Wallenberg was Swedish and the Swedes were perfect Aryans, according to Hitler, they kind of let him get away with it. And in so doing, he saved large numbers of the Jews, the Jewish community of Budapest. And there's other stories. I would be remiss, though, if I don't mention a certain country that needs to be singled out here. And in my book, and it's just mine, you don't have to agree with me, my book can hold its head much higher than most other nations during this time period, including the United States, and that's Denmark. And many of you may know the story of Denmark. Denmark, small nation, not a military might by any stretch of the imagination, sitting on the northern part of Germany. Yes, they are Aryans, good Aryans as well. When Hitler took Denmark under Nazi rule, he, for a longest time, kind of left them alone. He didn't impose all kind of real stringent problems on the Danish people, including the Danish Jews. There were approximately 7,500 Jews living in Denmark who had been fully integrated into Danish society, most of them living in Copenhagen, the capital. And the Danish authorities got word that there was going to be a roundup of Jews coming up on Rosh Hashanah. Hitler liked to do things on Jewish holidays. It was a thing that he had. So on the upcoming Rosh Hashanah, there was going to be a roundup, a mass roundup of the Jews of Denmark. And the Danish people, I mean, it didn't happen overnight, trust me, but to make the story short, the Danish people decided that the Danish Jews are as much a part of our country as anybody else, so why should they be treated any differently? And why should you do anything different to them? They were able to get the majority of the Danish Jews secretly out of Denmark and across to neutral Sweden in fishing boats and other, I mean, they did an amazing, massive rescue effort to get the Danish Jews to safety. But one thing people don't also realize in this story, and that was massive, it was the only country to really mobilize to do that. Now, they were lucky. They had a strait of water that could be treacherous, but was a neutral country close by and that was willing to take them. The other thing that people don't realize that the Danish government also did, because it doesn't get as much publicity as the rescue effort, is they also told the Danish Jews, when you come back, when this is over, when you come back, your homes will be here. Your synagogues will be here. Everything that you are leaving will be here for you. So not only were they rescued, they were also promised that we are not going to allow your houses or your homes to be taken over by someone else. We are not going to allow your religious institutions to be destroyed. We will protect them and we will preserve them. So it is estimated that of the entire Danish Jewish population, only 500 ended up being deported out of Denmark. And of those 500, approximately half of them perished and the other half survived till the end of the war. So a very, very small number of Danish Jews ended up falling victims to the Nazis. Interestingly enough, growing up, our neighbor across the street, this is in Ohio, our neighbor across the street was Danish. She married a US soldier. She grew up in Denmark and she married a US soldier and they came and they ended up in Toledo, Ohio, which is where I grew up. And I remember asking her at one point, I said, so what about Denmark? What about the people in Denmark? And she got mad at me. She got mad at me. She says, why are you asking me about this? I said, well, because Denmark did something that other countries didn't do, in saving the Jewish population. She goes, we only did what was the right thing. Why do people make such a big deal out of it? And she wouldn't talk about it. She said, we did the right thing. Why are people making a big deal out of doing the right thing? And I didn't argue with her. I wasn't going to argue with her. What I kind of wanted to say was because most countries didn't do the right thing.
Yeah. Tim, didn't the King of Denmark's kind of set the example, though? When I think he was the one that came out and wore the Jewish star on his armband.
We don't know that's almost now kind of more legend and myth than real, but it's a good story and they're a wonderful children's book of his. Interestingly enough, his name was King Christian, interestingly enough. But it is said that, yes, when they said to the Danish Jews, you will put on the Star of David, that he made a proclamation that, well, you know what? We're all going to be Jews because the Jews are no different than the rest of us. So let's all put the star on, including me. So is it myth? Did it really happen? The one thing we do know for a fact is there was a massive selling of yellow tulips throughout Denmark. Tulips that probably, I don't know, they grew their own, but probably from Holland, the Netherlands. And it was sort of a quiet anti-Nazi symbol to carry yellow tulips with you. It's kind of interesting. But the whole business with the star, a lot of people say it's legendary. It makes for a great story, but it does kind of epitomize what happened in Denmark. So I like the story. I think it's a great story. In my mind, I kind of want to believe it just because I like it, and we can believe what we want to believe. But the people of Denmark really, really, I think, deserve, some kind of recognition for taking in what could have been a horrible situation for, 7,500 of their own citizens and doing, the right thing. So pretty awesome story. Yes, question.
A question, two questions. One, you mentioned as far as being like a children's story. If when you're making up our list, if there are any children's books that you recommend, I'd be curious to know those.
Well, one book that it's not so much children, but it's younger. I mean, it would be more like probably 4th, 5th grade curriculum is a book called Number the Stars, which is about Denmark. It's about the friendship of two girls, one who is Christian, one who is Jewish. They grow up, they live in the same neighborhood. They go to each other's homes and celebrate holidays together. Then the war breaks out, the Nazis come in, and how they try to keep their friendship going. It's a great story for young people to understand the elements of what was happening during the
What is
Holocaust.
the name again, Tim?
Number the Stars. I'll
Number-
put it on the bibliography for sure.
Okay, and there's another one to add. I don't know if you know the story of the authors of Curious George.
No, don't. I don't.
Curious George is the story of the monkey.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Okay. They were from, where were they?
Sure.
Germany, and how they rode a bicycle and rode out and ended up in France. And they had the manuscript with them. It was saved. They then came by way of Switzerland, I think, to the United States. But it is a wonderful story for children, showing what they went through to not only get out, but Curious George's parents
Right.
were Jewish.
That's interesting. I did not know that. I did not know that. Great.
Now to look at Curious George differently. Huh?
Yes, I do. I like the stories, but I have a whole new respect now.
It's a very beautiful story.
Right. All right, let's move on to resistance. Resistance took different forms. There were what are called partisans. Partisans are not formally trained soldiers. They don't have military training. They didn't go through basic training in any sort of military way. Partisans are just everyday people who decide they want to pick up arms and fight back with no training whatsoever, or very little training whatsoever. And there were Jewish partisans, and people often forget that. There were groups of Jews who had left and escaped into the countryside before they were rounded up, who banded together to try to get arms, not always successfully, who tried to do whatever they could to sabotage whatever they could the Nazis were doing, to somehow hinder Nazi programs, Nazis moving forward. These partisan units existed in different countries at different times in an attempt to stop what was happening against their fellow Jews. How many of them, because these were unorganized bands of people, we don't really know how many there were, but the estimated number is between 25,000 and 30,000 Jewish partisans that were active throughout the war in different areas, in different countries. Some more successful than others, some larger groups than other groups. But again, the biggest problem that these Jewish partisans had was nobody would help them. They would go to the partisans who were non-Jewish, the Polish partisans, the French partisans, and say, we're all fighting the same enemy. We're all fighting for the same goal, to stop Nazism. Can't we work together? And most often, the answer was no, no. The nationalist partisans from the different nations did not want to work hand in hand with the Jewish partisans in most cases. So sadly, because together, larger numbers, they probably would have been more effective going against the Nazis. But again, the latent anti-Semitism of just the common people, they wouldn't agree to work together with the Jewish partisans. So in most cases, the Jewish partisans had to work entirely on their own. Didn't stop them. They continued to do what they could do. And as long as you were able-bodied and willing, they would find some way to use you if it meant doing something to stop the Nazis or stop something from happening. Partisans were known to sabotage rail tracks at times, so the Nazis would have to send somebody out and fix them. They were known to sabotage Nazi vehicles that had to be sitting. Nobody was in them. They would do what they could to sabotage the vehicles. Whatever they could do. It wasn't a matter of necessarily shootouts and things of that sort, but anything they could do to hinder progress and to make it more difficult and to make it more challenging was at least a little bit of success. Again, there are some books written on different partisan units. Again, because what we know of them is not a lot, because these were not organized bands, like an army would be under a national flag. So a lot of what we know is sketchy, a little bit from some of the survivors who were part of them. And that's what we have.
Comment on that, Tim.
Yeah.
We were fortunate enough to have one of the survivors who was part of what was called the Bielski brothers, which was probably one of the most famous. I think it was the largest rescue of Jews by Jews, and I think it was in the Polish or the Soviet occupied area.
It was Poland, yes.
It was Poland at the time. But there is a museum now of the partisans, where you can get a lot of information, because I know these people were very, the people that lived in northern Jersey with us, she was very, very instrumental in starting the Holocaust education and in a big contributor to the partisan museum that's there. But the rescue was portrayed in a film a couple of years ago about the Bielski brothers. Daniel Craig was in it. I forget the name of the film.
Yes, I don't.
Defense. Jane just said it was Defense, something like that. Yeah,
I know, and I never got the chance to see it. I never did.
Yeah,
I remember
it's
the
well
movie.
worth seeing. Yeah,
Yeah, I remember the movie.
he has had some documentaries as well
Right.
on the Bielski brothers. They
Right.
live in New York, actually. They had lived in New York.
Yeah, it's something that I would like to see. I'm gonna have to try to see if I can get a hold of that, find it somewhere. It's got to be out there. All right, let's move on to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which is again a story that maybe many of us are familiar with. Throughout the time of the Warsaw Ghetto, where were the Jews being deported? When the train would leave the Warsaw Ghetto, the majority of Warsaw's Jews were taken to the death camp at Treblinka. By the time when Hitler decided that he wanted the ghetto liquidated completely, he just wanted it gone. He wanted all of the remaining Jews to be shipped out, and then he wanted to level the Warsaw Ghetto to the ground. At that point, and we're talking 1943, spring of 1943, in the spring of 1943, there were 56,000 Jewish residents still living in the ghetto, 56,000. Remember, there had been 450,000 at the beginning. So now we're down to 56,000 people remaining within the Warsaw Ghetto. Within those 56,000 were some people who just decided, you know what, we're going to try to do what we can do to save ourselves. Known as the JFO, or the Jewish Fighting Organization, a much longer term to say in Polish, which I'm not even going to try. So the Jewish Fighting Organization was secretly meeting, because remember, you had to be really careful on everything you were doing, and you were being watched, led by a young man. I believe he was 24 years old, if I remember correctly. His name was Mordecai Anielewicz, and he kind of took charge of this ragtag group of people, all of whom were just interested in saying, let's do what we can do. We don't know what we can do, but let's do what we can do to try to thwart the Nazis' plan. So General Stroop, the German Nazi general who was in charge of liquidating the Warsaw Ghetto, decided that they were going to begin the process of liquidation on April 19th, 1943, because for two reasons. It was Hitler's birthday, so he was going to give the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto as a birthday present to Hitler. And it also happened to be the night of the first Seder, Passover. And remember, I said they like to do things on Jewish holidays. So combination birthday present to Hitler. Let's do it on the first night of Passover, when normally Jews would be celebrating the first Seder. That's when we're going to march into the ghetto, and we're just going to take the remaining prisoners. We're going to destroy it, burn it to the ground, and that is going to be the end of the ghetto. When the gates opened and the Nazis marched in, they did not expect to have all kinds of things raining down upon them. Homemade explosives, things like we might call Molotov cocktails. The JFO had managed to secure some weaponry, some guns. Some had been smuggled in from the Christian side, so gunfire was ringing out. And once again, the thing that the Jews in Warsaw had that the Germans did not is they knew how to go down into the sewers and get from building to building, so they could surprise them. You know, all of a sudden gunfire is coming from over here, then now all of a sudden it's coming from a different place. It took the Germans completely off guard. They were not expecting to encounter any kind of fighting or any kind of resistance. So after this went on for a time, the Germans retreated. They actually retreated out of the ghetto without succeeding in taking it, liquidating it, and destroying it. This kind of guerrilla warfare, because that's really what it was on the part of the Jews, this kind of guerrilla warfare against the Nazis lasted for nearly a month, which is so incredible when you think about the hardships of what these Jews were going through, what they had already been through, and the kind of determination, the spirit they must have had to do this. So for almost an entire month, they kept the Nazis from succeeding in completely destroying the ghetto. The problem came is they ran out. They simply could get no more arms, no more ammunitions. They were trying to get more from outside the ghetto, get more smuggled in. Again, they were not able to get more help. And so they really had no choice at one point but to surrender. So the Warsaw Ghetto surrender occurred on May 16th of 1943. So from April 19th, 1943 to May 16th of 1943, you had this revolution in the ghetto of these Jews trying to hold off the Nazi armies. What happened to those Jews who were still alive at this point, because many had died, some had been taken prisoners, some had been captured at this point. The Jews who were still alive had a couple of options. Surrender, give yourself up. They're going to put you on a train. And by this time, they knew where they were going. You know, word had gotten back, which is what was happening. So that was one option. Commit suicide was another option. And there were those who did do that. Just decided, I'm not going to give my hands to the Nazis. I would rather take my own life, which is a violation, as we know, of Jewish ethics and Jewish ideas. But I have a feeling that in this situation, I'm not God, but I think it would be okay. I'm just going to say that. And some said, or you can try to escape. You can go down in the sewers and you can try to escape and get out and maybe get to the Christian side of the wall. And maybe, just maybe, someone will take mercy on you and help you to hide whatever might happen. Or you may be captured on the other side. But if you want to make the attempt to try to get out. So people had to make their choice of what they were going to do. Turn themselves in, commit suicide, or try to get out. And different people decided, and there were still children still living in the ghetto at this point. If you took a child down into the sewers, what happens if all of a sudden the baby starts screaming and crying and gives you away? What do? You can try to quiet them. You can try to keep them close to you so it's not heard. I mean, so you're taking a risk. You're taking a risk. I mean, there's really no great choice out of those three options. The one that seemed to be the possibility of living would be the one to try to escape. And there were some who did. There were some who were able to successfully get through the sewers and get out. But ultimately, the Nazis threw poisonous gas down into the sewer system in the ghetto as well, just to root out anybody who might still be down there. But by that time, some people had managed to get out on the Christian side, come up on the sewers on the Christian side, and get away. So the ending of the ghetto was not necessarily good, but I think what we have to look at is the bravery of the people who thought, let's just do what we can do and try to see if we can't survive, if we can't do something. I have always been in awe of what they did for that month, to do what they did to keep the Nazi soldiers from liquidating the ghetto and to keep Hitler from getting his birthday present. So it's a pretty remarkable story. It's been told in movies. It's been told in books. If any of you have read Leon Uris's Mila 18, which is sort of a fictionalized but based on historic account of the whole situation in the Warsaw Ghetto. It's really well done book. There was a television movie maybe 15 years back called, I think it was called Resistance. It was about the whole Warsaw Ghetto fight. If you've read John Hersey's book, The Wall, is also about the Warsaw Ghetto and what was going on. So there is good documentation for the story out there. Any questions about the Warsaw Ghetto before we move on? See, I told you this was going to be a longer night. All right, resistance in the death camps. Yes, there were revolts in the death camps among the prisoners, hard as that may seem to believe. There was a revolt in Treblinka, there was a revolt in Sobibor, and there was a revolt in Auschwitz. So those 3 death camps, at one time, there was a revolt among the prisoners in an attempt to escape, in an attempt to break free out of the camp. Different scenarios, different situations, whether they stormed the gates and tried to overtake the guards and take them by surprise. In most cases, these revolts were not entirely successful in terms of people escaping or getting out, because once you got outside, let's say you got outside the gate or outside the fence, the barbed wire electrified fence surrounding, where were you going to go? And how much strength did you actually have to keep going? And so in often cases, once you broke free, you were captured not that long after and brought back and of course killed. So it wasn't an entirely successful operation. Probably the most successful of the 3 was the one that occurred at Sobibor. And the reason why the revolt at Sobibor was more successful was at the time the revolt happened, there were Ukrainian soldiers who had been captured and sent to Sobibor, not necessarily Jewish soldiers. They were Ukrainian soldiers who were fighting against the Nazis, whom the Nazis had captured and sent to Sobibor. And they worked in conjunction with the Jewish prisoners to try to make this revolt happen. And these soldiers were, of course, more well-trained. They were stronger because they had not been in the camp for very long. And so they had a little bit more ability to help organize. So the revolt at Sobibor actually succeeded. I believe they succeeded in murdering 10 to 12 SS guards secretly. It was, and then at one point they did storm the gates and were able to break through and get into the countryside. Some of them did manage to stay free, but a large number of them were recaptured and brought back into the camp. But if memory serves me correctly, the one thing that they did succeed in doing as well is after that revolt at Sobibor, the Nazis shut the camp down. So no more people would be murdered there. If you want to read an interesting book about the whole Sobibor thing, there is a book called, interestingly enough, called Escape from Sobibor. Escape from Sobibor. I don't know if it's still in print, but it's a good book about the uprising in Sobibor. Okay. Anything at this point before we move on, so I can try to hopefully get you. There's a lot to think about here. So let's talk a little bit about liberation. Liberation, of course, meaning the war is ending, the Nazis are being defeated, which is what we'd been hoping for since they took over in Germany in 1933. The first camp to be liberated, the first death camp to be liberated was Majdanek. Majdanek was the first camp that came under Allied control, and it was under the control of the Soviet Union. It was Soviet Union soldiers who came to Majdanek in July of 1944. As they were beating the Nazis back and defeating them militarily, in July of 1944, they happened upon the camp, the death camp at Majdanek. Auschwitz was liberated in January of 1945. Now, as somebody already alluded by mentioning Eisenhower, when Allied troops, be they Soviet, be they British, be they American, United States, came upon these camps, these places surrounded by barbed wire, even though these were men who were hardened soldiers who had been battling on the front of war and obviously seen ugly, horribly bloody things on the war front, they were not prepared for what they found behind the barbed wire. And I don't know how they could be. I don't know how they could be. They were greeted by starving, sick, emaciated people who were exhausted to the point of a step away from death, who had been left behind. The Nazis tried to evacuate or kill all the prisoners before they left the camp, but they rarely succeeded in doing that. So ultimately, there would be prisoners left behind who were still there. And you've probably seen some of the pictures. And these were like walking skeletons. And they had to think quickly on their feet as to what they were going to do. The places were filthy, the stench of death, because they also found piles of unburied and unburned corpses lying around. And so the stench of rotting corpses was permeating the air. Interestingly enough, I found this statistic as well. When they liberated Auschwitz, they found in the camp 348,000 pressed and on hangers, men's suits. Men's suits, 348,000. And 836,000 women's coats were in the camp. Obviously, they were supposed to be sent back to Germany at some point, but that did not happen, as well as thousands and thousands of pairs of shoes, too, all awaiting shipment back to Germany. But they were still in the camp when the soldiers came in. Now, we have to understand a couple of things here. These prisoners who were left behind, at first were very leery of these soldiers. Think about it. People in uniform had not been nice to you, had beaten you, had treated you horribly. So seeing someone in a soldier's uniform at first was frightening. But what they noticed was there was no swastikas. The swastika was absent. And when it began to dawn on them that these were not German soldiers, then they felt the business of feeling relieved. The soldiers had to be very careful. Of course, their first instinct was to reach into their supplies and open the food and just start feeding the people. People that severely malnourished, if given too much food at one time, will die. It will kill them. Food has to be introduced back into their systems very, very slowly. So while your first instinct would be to open up the can of soup or do whatever you've got and give it to them because they're starving, in essence, you would be killing them. So now you've got these soldiers in this horrible sort of moral dilemma. We want to feed you, but we also understand that we have to do this very, very carefully. But the soldiers did come into the camps and did make an attempt to try to get water running so people could at least clean themselves. They could have drinking water, etc. Ultimately, Red Cross would come in. International Red Cross brigades would come in as well and begin to try to help. The other thing that happened is in the area where these camps were, any remaining Nazi authorities were brought into the camps, and they were the ones who were made to bury the remaining bodies. You're going to do this work. You're going to bury the bodies now. And this people living in the surrounding countryside were made to come in and look. This is what was going on. To almost a person, they all said, we didn't know. We didn't know. And to that, I'll use a British phrase, poppycock. Because there's no way they couldn't have known what was happening. There's no way. But who wants to admit to Allied soldiers that you knew what was going on and it just kept going on and it just kept going on, or that you were part of it, that you had helped to run the place, that you had turned a blind eye to what was going on. So there's a lot happening here. You've got the prisoners who need to be tended to try to save their lives, even though they're so close to death. You've got soldiers who are trying to do the right thing to help them in horribly, horribly difficult situations. And now you've got the Red Cross coming in, trying also to do what they can to try to save the lives of those who are remaining. It was a very, very difficult situation. It was going to take a long time. This was not going to, be something that was done and over with in a matter of a week or a month. In many cases, most of these people who were still alive in these various camps, because one by one, as the Nazis were defeated, more and more camps were coming under Allied control, whether they were large camps, big camps, death camps, concentration camps. All of these now were filled with the still remaining prisoners who had not been killed and who had not been marched away. Most of them had no place to go. Their families, where were they? Were they still alive? Were they still there? Most of their Jewish communities that they had come from were destroyed. So there wasn't even a town necessarily to go back to. Their homes had been taken over by local populations. Oh, they're gone. It's our house now. So even if they could get back, they wouldn't even find their home. And sadly enough, a large number of the countries they came from made it quite clear, we don't want you back. We don't want you. Which is a very sad thing, but true. In fact, there were instances of pogroms and attacks against Jews who tried to go back to their hometowns. The most famous being in Poland. In 1946, 42 Jews who had been in camps and were now going to try to go back to their town. The town was Kielce in Poland, is the name of not a very large city necessarily. They arrived, and on July 4th, interestingly enough, 1946, 42 of them were murdered at the hands of the Poles. Not by Nazis, by the hands of the Poles in the town where they were trying to go back to. When Allied authorities stepped in and went to the bishop, the Roman Catholic bishop, and said, look, you can't let this happen. The bishop sort of shrugged their shoulders, raised their hands and said, what do you want us to do about it? So even then, there was still this element of anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish feelings that were still at work, in spite of everything that had just happened, in spite of what was being revealed. Because this was so horrific and because it was so horrible, Eisenhower, along with the French, the British, and the Soviets, decided that they needed a record of this because they said, people aren't going to believe this. People will not believe that human beings did this to other human beings. They're not going to believe it because it's so much beyond what we would think to be possible. And so, again, in an interesting twist of fate, it was famous film director Alfred Hitchcock, who was dispatched by the British government to work under the Allied generals and to film and to document in film what was found in these camps. The bodies, the emaciated survivors, the filth, the degradation. So he took his camera crews into these camps. I think he was in 3 or 4 different ones, and he filmed it. So there would be a permanent record. And they were going to make a finished documentary film, and it was going to be shown throughout the world. That didn't happen. Once the footage was finished, it was never completed with a soundtrack because the thought was it was too difficult for people to watch. So the film it was shelved. The reels were there. They were unfinished in their rare kind of, unfinished form, without narration, without any sort of, background. And they remained in a vault until I believe it was 1982, when they were actually broadcast for the first time on PBS, and the show Frontline, which I believe is still on with Judy Woodruff. They were show it. They didn't doctor it up. They just showed the unfinished film as it was, as Hitchcock made it. And that was the first time that people actually saw those films. But they still exist as a record of what Allied soldiers found when they went into the camps and they liberated. All right, to try to put a little bit of an end to this, the displaced person camps, they had to put these people who had nowhere to go, they had to do something for them. So DP camps, or displaced person camps, that were under the control of the Allied forces and the International Red Cross jointly, were set up in different countries. Some of them had thousands of people in them, people who had no place to go. There were attempts to locate surviving family members. One of the things that would happen every day in a DP camp was lists would be posted. These are the survivors we have found. Check to see if anybody you know is on the list. So these lists would be posted in all the DP camps. They were gathering the names of the survivors. And people would scour the list daily to see if anybody in their family was still alive. In many cases, the news was bad, but every now and then you'd find a cousin, an aunt, an uncle, a relative, somebody who was still alive, or maybe even just a neighbor or friend from your hometown, but somebody that you knew. Survivors did make, in the camps, made applications to be granted as immigrants to other nations to try to get immigrant status. Once again, nations were not just opening their arms to take people in. You might think that after all this, the nations would be a little bit more lenient. Yes, countries did up their quotas to some extent, but not enough to take in all of the survivors. Many realized they couldn't go home, so they wanted to go to Palestine. Remember, there's no state of Israel yet. There is no Israel. Hasn't been declared. It would be 1948 before that would happen. So they wanted to go to Palestine, which was still under British mandate at that point, so under the control of Britain. The British didn't want them going to Palestine, and so the ships would be blockaded. You all know the story of the Exodus, the ship. So the British would not let the ships land in Palestine on the shores of the Mediterranean. And so the ships would flounder at sea, or they would be sent back to Cyprus. And now you're sent back to another DP camp on Cyprus to wait it out and see what's going to happen to you. It's sad that this is the fate of these people who had already been through so much, and were now simply trying to put their lives back together in the best way that they could. And there was not a whole lot of help out there. Were conditions in the DP camps good? In some situations, yes. And in some situations, they were not great places to be either. Oh, you weren't being beaten and you weren't being starved, but they were not, certainly by any stretch of the imagination, luxurious. And in some cases, they were run by people who were pretty stern and in some cases pretty brutal. The last DP camp, the last displaced persons camp, did not close until 1959. There were still people living in these DP camps until the late 50s. So in 1959, the last of those camps finally closed. So, for almost 15 years after liberation, after the end of the war, there were still people who were floundering as to where to go, as to what to do. It's very, very sad. And then just quickly, long-term effects of these people who survived: psychological, emotional, mental, let alone physical. How do you put what happened to you behind you? Can you forget it? And one of the biggest questions was, I survived. My family did not. Why me? Why me? Why did I survive? but my brothers and sisters didn't, and my mother and father didn't, or my wife and my children didn't, or my husband and my children didn't. There was this tremendous amount of guilt because you survived and no one else in your family survived. There were going to, these were effects that were going to be haunting people for many, many years. Many of the survivors did not want to talk about their experiences. They just didn't want to talk about it. And there were some who went to their deaths and never spoke of it, never spoke of it. Too difficult, too painful, didn't want to relive it, didn't want to think about it. Another sad thing that happened, and this was devastating in some ways to the Jewish community in general, many of them were fearful of ever identifying themselves as Jewish again. Because if being Jewish brings you this kind of death and this kind of pain and this kind of suffering, why do I want to say I'm Jewish? They kind of gave up on Judaism. They put their lives together as best they could. They had children, never told their children they were Jewish because they didn't want that. It was too difficult. It was too painful. Sometimes maybe many, many years down the road, they would finally be able to deal with it, and sometimes maybe never. So, while we think of liberation as, and certainly was a good thing, it didn't make everything okay. It didn't make everything, back to the way it was. Things were still going to be very, very difficult for those who did survive, and thank God they did, but it was going to be a challenge. And since the years of the Holocaust, I would like to sit here and tell you, I would like to, but I can't, tell you that the world learned its lesson from the Holocaust. But we know that it didn't. We know that it didn't, because we know there have been other instances of genocide since the Holocaust. So, does the world learn its lessons? It doesn't seem like we do. It's sad to say, but it's the reality. So any questions, comments?
Tim?
Yes.
Another thing, quite an insult to the survivors is that theory of denial, that it didn't exist.
Right.
So everything they've gone through, and then there's that group saying, this didn't happen, and they were what they call them, work camps, they were this, they were that. So when did that theory come about, the denial?
It probably was already there, but it became much more prominent into the 70s and 80s, where college professors, my brother, who is a college professor at the University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario, has a colleague on his staff. He did. I don't know if he's still there. I should ask him, who was a Holocaust denier. And he was a college professor on the faculty.
And he's teaching students.
Yes.
Spreading.
But he wrote articles denying the Holocaust. So Holocaust denial really sort of came out of the woodwork much more prominently 70s, 80s, I think. It's still out there. We are not doing a good job of educating the world on the Holocaust. If you've seen recent surveys, there are 30-some% of people who have no clue as to when you say the word Holocaust, what it means. They don't know what it means. They have no idea.
And Jews are not teaching their children.
Exactly.
It comes out, it's not just non-Jews, it's
everybody. Yes. Kathy. Oh, gotta unmute yourself. I can't hear you.
Terry.
Terry.
No, I'm trying to get Kathy. Oh, it doesn't say you're muted, but I can't hear you.
Terry.
I'm sorry. Is your volume down? Do you have to turn your volume up on your computer?
Kara is muted.
Okay. Terry, you have a question?
Sure. My dad was in World War II, and there's a book, Rendezvous with Destiny. And he was in the 101st Airborne Division, and he had told me about when he went into Germany and everything. And so I learned about it, and I guess I always thought, well, war is icky. I didn't want to hear about it. And I have a book, that he saved, and I guess it's just been recently I'd been able to read it, but he told me about the conditions when he came into the camps and how horrible it was. So yeah, I grew up believing in the Holocaust. However, I had a roommate, my last roommate, he said, yeah, like that really happened. I said, are you serious? Yeah. And I took her to make the Israel and she found out, oh, she was wrong.
Yep, it's sad to say, but those people are there. Yes, Larry?
Tim, what do we know about the Argentinian connection with the Nazis? Why was that so wrong?
Oh, well, we know about it because Argentina at that time was under a fascist government. The Peronistas, Juan Perón was a fascist. And so he had sympathy for fellow fascists. And so when Nazis that were escaping, and this is a whole nother thing we could get into, oftentimes with the help of the United States, but let's not go there, to escape, Argentina was a friendly nation that would take them. So what was interesting is you had a Jewish population in Argentina, which is fairly sizable. And now you've got escaped Nazis coming there under the auspices of Juan Perón, who is giving them safe haven because they're fellow fascists, and were allowed to then just pick up their lives and go on.
The interesting thing, Tim, was that Perón would also take in Jewish refugees, one of the few places that would, as long as they paid. As long as they had the money, he would take them in.
Exactly.
We also know they were sort of in hiding when they were there, though, right? They weren't out in the public, as we've seen, you know, with the Eichmann connection and with.
I think initially, but I think eventually many of them took on identities that were new and different, and began to live in the mainstream of society. Just not talking about, many of the Nazis that escaped to Argentina ended up with a pretty good life.
And any idea of the extent to which the number of Nazis went there?
I don't know numbers necessarily, but there were quite a few. I mean, I guess I should look into that a little bit more. It's just it was one of the governments that was perfectly okay with former Nazis coming over.
Yeah, well, also East Berlin, of course, had Nazis in it, and when they were running the government, even under the Soviets.
Well, we know they found them here.
And we certainly had them too, especially in our space programs.
We have them. I mean, every now and then they still come up, find somebody. They're old and dying, but they got away and they took on new identities and whatever, and lived among. I mean, people get shocked, like, oh, how could you say that about such and such? We're such a good neighbor. Well, hey.
Yeah. The other side of the story, you mentioned nothing good came out of it, and obviously, you can't justify anything good coming out of it, but some of the ultra-religious people do believe that, well, maybe not ultra-religious, but some people believe that the state of Israel was basically the outgrowth of the Holocaust.
Right.
That was the redemption.
Right. There's a theory, yes, that Israel came into being because of the Holocaust, because it built a greater sympathy in the world for Jews and what had happened to them. So I would venture to say there probably was some truth in that, definitely. So,
Tim, when they captured Eichmann, it brought a lot of things to the forefront too.
Yes.
And that was bringing out people being more aware.
Right.
Well,
right. And you have to remember, if you're familiar with Elie Wiesel's book, Night, which is one of the,
right,
books on the Holocaust, he did not write that until 1959. So that was 14 years.
I didn't know that.
14 years after liberation. And he was encouraged to write it by a Jesuit priest in France. It was written in French first. And he was encouraged by a Jesuit priest that he had befriended to write his experiences down and to write the book. And then it was published in French first, and then eventually in English and other languages too. But it was 14 years before he could put that down and get the book published. So even though it's considered a classic of the genre of Holocaust literature, he did not do it immediately. I mean, he obviously needed time to deal with his own issues and demons and whatever.
When did the Diary of Anne Frank come out?
Oh, I want to say somewhere in the late 50s as well.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Oh, you know the story on that.
Well, her father returned, right? Her father returns back to the house, and supposedly Mepes is the one who had saved the diary.
Right, Mepes, yes.
Yeah.
She wrote a book, and her book is terrific. I gave you that on the.
Yeah, it's a great book. I have read that book. It's a very good book.
She was quite a person. Yeah.
All right, people. It's been a long night.
Yes, too long.
very long, and I'm sorry it's not more uplifting, but you know, the subject matter isn't. But I want to wish you all, thank you for taking the class, being here. Hopefully you learned
Thank
something.
you.
Thank you, Tim, for giving it.
Magnificent
It's a
job.
tough course.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Yes, let's end on a happy Thanksgiving
Yeah,
note.
happy
And
Thanksgiving.
everybody can have a good holiday. Enjoy
Stay safe.
delicious food, stay healthy, stay safe, relax, and let's be thankful for being here. Let's just be thankful for that.
Tim, is the rabbi doing his class tomorrow morning or no?
I don't think so. I think pretty much, other than this one, I think they canceled everything for this week.
Okay,
Right.
all right.
No.
Okay.
Okay. Good night, everybody. Happy Thanksgiving. I
Do you have any
will
more
see you all very
classes?
soon.
Have
Have a
any
good
more-
night.
Any more classes?
Yes,
Pardon me?
thank you.
Anything else in the pipeline as far as classes that you're considering doing?
Oh, I'm working on some things. Yes, don't worry. As soon as I finish one, my mind starts going to something new.
Has this been recorded?
Yes, it'll be on YouTube.
Okay, in other words, if we wanted to show it to our kids, we can get it.
Yes, all three should be there. I don't know that this one will be there right away, but it will be there.
Okay, thank you very much. Outstanding.
All right. Thank you. Again, happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Good